I never imagined I'd be standing in a pile of splintered wood and shattered glass, looking at the place my cousin called home, only to realize the HOA had bulldozed it as if it were some insignificant speed bump on the road to their shiny new project. Yet there I was, my heart pounding, hands shaking, and tears stinging my eyes at the sight of the wreckage that once was my cousin Jackson's cottage. They had no idea who Jackson really was, a decorated U.S. Army general with decades of strategic, leadership, and logistical expertise under his belt. But I knew this wasn't about revenge. For Jackson, it would be a matter of setting things right and ensuring no other family endured such brash overreach again. My story starts a few weeks prior, at the end of July, when Jackson called to say he'd be deployed overseas for a special advisory mission, something hush-hush and urgent. After a career spanning more than 30 years, Jackson was one of those steadfast, dependable men who never sought the limelight, yet somehow always found himself in the thick of action whenever his country called. This time, he asked if I could keep an eye on his cozy one-story ranch house in Glendale Forest Estates, a seemingly idyllic and quiet community nestled in the rolling countryside. I was more than happy to oblige. As Jackson's closest living relative, I'd grown up looking to him the way a younger sibling might admire a wise, steady older brother. I go by once a week, water the plants, collect the mail, and make sure everything was secure. It seemed straightforward enough, until I encountered the Glendale Forest Estates Homeowners Association, HOA. On my first visit, I parked near the clubhouse to grab a guest parking pass. The building itself was a giant, red brick monolith that looked out of place amid the gentle slopes of farmland surrounding the neighborhood. Despite the day's sweltering summer heat, the lush grass was perfectly manicured. Rows of hedges were trimmed into geometric shapes, and there wasn't a single stray leaf in sight. My father used to joke that HOAs were mini-governments, but I never fully understood the sentiment until I stepped into that clubhouse. It reeked of starch and newly printed agendas. A stern woman at the reception desk, identified by her name tag as Phyllis C., board secretary, handed me a thin packet of rules, known as the CC and RS, covenants, conditions, and restrictions. She rattled off a memorized script about the importance of maintaining property values, being a good neighbor, and adhering to the architectural guidelines. I nodded politely. I'd heard stories of HOAs being strict, but Glendale Forest Estates took things to a new level. When I mentioned I was there for Jackson Hale's property, she raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. I sensed there might be a history, an unspoken tension. Before leaving, she quietly added, "Remember to mow the lawn every Saturday, or you'll be subject to fines." General Hale has been behind on that. The word general slipped out as if it pained her to say it. My internal alarms began to ring. That first trip to Jackson's place was serene, though. The ranch house, built of sturdy cedar and fieldstone, overlooked a modest pond where ducks often paddled under the willow trees. He'd chosen the spot for peace and quiet after decades of intense military deployments. The interior was cozy, decorated with souvenirs from tours in Germany, Japan, and the Middle East. Stacks of reading material about global affairs and American history lined the shelves, and on the walls hung plaques commemorating Jackson's service. I went about my duties, pulling a few weeds, refreshing the bird feeders, and watering the potted chrysanthemums on the porch. True to form, Jackson had left things organized. Labeled keys, a phone list for repairs, a small notebook detailing monthly tasks. The place felt untouched by the rest of Glendale Forest Estates' fussy regulations, which only made me love it more. But a week later, I returned to find a bright orange notice taped to the front door, violation of community standards. My stomach clenched. It claimed that the grass near the pond was excessively overgrown and demanded immediate remediation. The notice threatened to escalate the matter if not addressed within 10 days. I frowned. After all, Jackson had intentionally preserved that small stretch of taller grass to help migrating geese nest safely. Did the HOA have no appreciation for nature or for common decency? I tried to reason with Phyllis the following day, explaining the environmental significance of that patch. She barely let me finish a sentence before curtly stating, We have policies in place to maintain aesthetic uniformity. Exceptions cause property value decreases. Her tone was dismissive, and she wouldn't even look me in the eyes. It was as if she held a grudge. I took care of the grass issue, though I hated cutting down that small sanctuary for geese. The next couple of visits were uneventful, and I held on to a faint hope that all would remain calm until Jackson returned. Then, one Saturday morning, I heard a rumor around the neighborhood that the HOA was planning a major community improvement project. The rumor mill hinted it involved expanding the clubhouse and adding a new pool, something that had been debated for years but never fully approved. It wasn't until I turned onto Jackson Street that I saw the flashing lights of heavy machinery. Several bright yellow bulldozers and excavators lined the cul-de-sac, their engines roaring. My heart started pounding. A group of HOA board members stood nearby, wearing hard hats that clashed with their pressed khakis and polo shirts. Dread flooded me as I realized they were heading right for Jackson's property. I sprinted over to the site, shouting, "What are you doing? This is private property." But the rumble of diesel engines swallowed my words. In the chaos, a foreman shrugged helplessly, pointing to a slip of paper he claimed authorized the demolition. No one would hear me. The next thing I knew, walls were coming down, windows shattering, and the roof caving in as clouds of dust billowed into the summer sky. By the time I forced my way to the center of it all, the house was barely standing, just a skeletal frame of beams and broken rafters. The once charming ranch, filled with Jackson's memories and treasures, was gone. And the HOA board members? They looked triumphant, as if they'd accomplished a mission. Never in my life had I felt such a mix of fury and disbelief. Standing in the wreckage, I could only think of Jackson overseas, serving his country with honor, never suspecting that his own community, one supposedly dedicated to preserving property values and neighborly harmony, could commit such brazen destruction. The quiet was deafening as the machinery idled, the last section of Jackson's living room wall collapsing in a thunderous roar. They had no idea whom they'd just challenged, and frankly, neither did I. Not fully. All I knew was that I couldn't let this stand. After the initial shock wore off, I attempted to confront the on-site board members. Leading the pack was a tall, lean man in his 60s with salt and pepper hair, wearing a polo emblazoned with HOA president. His nameplate read Hugh Ross. He had the calm demeanor of a politician who thought himself untouchable. No matter what I said, how I demanded an explanation, brandishing Jackson's deed to prove rightful ownership, he refused to acknowledge any wrongdoing. We posted multiple notices, he claimed, slipping his hands into his pockets. The property was in violation for over a year. We had no choice but to condemn it. It was an eyesore, and the board voted to incorporate this land into our clubhouse expansion. The community will benefit immensely. His words hit me like an avalanche of arrogance. I sputtered, condemned? This was not some abandoned shack. This was an occupied home, my cousin's. He's overseas on a military assignment. He gave no authorization for any demolition. Ross's face reddened slightly, but he maintained that practiced composure. "I'm sorry for your confusion," he said, though he didn't sound sorry at all. "We followed procedure. Perhaps your cousin should have responded to our letters." Letters? I wondered if the HOA had been sending them to Jackson's house instead of forwarding them, and I realized with mounting horror that the board had systematically built a case against him for minor infractions until it culminated in a condemnation vote, likely overshadowed by that major improvement project. My protest fell on deaf ears. In the distance, I noticed Phyllis scribbling notes as if each outburst of mine was just another line in a formal complaint. Dejected, I turned away from the group, trying to think logically, but my hands were still shaking with anger. I wanted to scream, to call Jackson right then and there. But I remembered he was in a classified zone, unreachable except in rare emergencies. I inhaled slowly, forcing some composure. If Glendale Forest Estates wanted a fight, they'd get one. I just hoped it wouldn't destroy what was left of Jackson's peace. He had served countless years in the Army, and this was his reward from the very countrymen he'd protected. I spent the rest of that day sifting through the wreckage with a few sympathetic neighbors who couldn't believe what they'd witnessed. One older gentleman, Mr. Sanchez, shook his head and said, "I've lived here for 20 years, and this is the first time I've ever seen them act like that. It's like they wanted to make an example out of him." We found shattered picture frames, a couple of tarnished medals, some waterlogged photographs, sad remnants of a proud life's work. At nightfall, I returned to my small apartment on the outskirts of town. Exhausted, I sat at my kitchen table, the overhead light flickering in a silent staccato. I had a single phone number for Jackson's liaison officer in D.C., the person who could potentially route a message to him if there was an emergency. Was this enough of an emergency? My mind spun. Could I do anything here on my own, legally, to rectify the damage? Eventually, anger overshadowed indecision. I picked up the phone. The call was brief, a mere exchange of credentials and a message. "Sergeant Galloway, please inform General Hale that his property has been destroyed by his homeowners association. It's urgent he contact me ASAP." I didn't know if or when it would reach him, but I'd done my part. Days passed in anxious limbo, during which I tried to engage a lawyer. Most attorneys I contacted were reluctant to take on an HOA, especially one with Glendale Forest Estates' deep pockets and long-standing political connections in the county. I discovered that the community had a legal fund it aggressively tapped into whenever a homeowner threatened litigation. So the path of a lawsuit seemed daunting, but not impossible. As I gathered documents, I uncovered a pattern. The HOA had systematically targeted Jackson. He was consistently fined for grass length, for hosting unapproved visitors, which turned out to be me on the official record, and for minor architectural changes that apparently never existed. The board had declared his property in constant violation for the better part of a year, then used those violations as grounds to declare the home a blight. All of it reeked of a setup aimed at acquiring more land for their expansion project. I confronted a few neighbors at a small diner near the community. They were mostly retirees enjoying their golden years, folks who'd never expect to be at the center of legal drama. A couple admitted that the HOA had been dropping hints for months about wanting to build a larger clubhouse with an adjacent parking lot. Jackson's land was prime real estate, close to utilities and the main road, perfect for the development. During those 10 days of waiting, I kept vigil at what was left of Jackson's property, a flattened space surrounded by rubble. I set up a small folding chair, refusing to let the HOA move forward with any further construction. The board members filed daily complaints to the local sheriff about trespassing or loitering, but the sheriff was sympathetic when I showed him the deed. Technically, they still had no right to develop the land. It belonged to Jackson. And then, on the 11th day, I got the call. Jackson's voice cut through the static on the other end. It was the first time in years I'd heard him so rattled. "I just got your message," he said, his voice tight with controlled fury. "They did what?" I swallowed, my throat suddenly parched. "They bulldozed your house. Claimed it was condemned. They said you violated too many rules and wouldn't respond to notices." "I tried," Jackson interrupted, but not out of anger toward me. I could hear him trying to clamp down on seething rage. "My God, I left that place in perfect condition. Not only that, but they knew I was on deployment." He took a deep breath. "I'll be home as soon as I can manage. Don't you worry. We'll handle this." In the background, I heard the hum of a military base, a faint alarm or announcement. This was the kind of stress he didn't need, especially on deployment. But if I knew Jackson, he would funnel that frustration into methodical action. The HOA had made a grave mistake. After we hung up, I stared at my phone. Relief, anger, hope. My emotions were jumbled. One thing was clear. The Glendale Forest Estates HOA had just awakened a sleeping giant, and I had a front row seat for what would come next. Jackson arrived 4 days later, stepping off a nondescript black SUV that whisked him straight from the airport. He wore his Army combat uniform, an American flag patch on one shoulder, and a subdued rank insignia that belied just how high he stood in the chain of command. He hadn't even had time to change into civilian clothes. The lines under his eyes suggested jet lag and the lingering mental weight of his mission. Yet, as he took in the flattened remains of his home, his posture stiffened with unwavering resolve. "Walk me through everything," he said tersely, setting his duffel bag down on the cracked concrete driveway. Without a word, I handed him photos, copies of violation notices, and transcripts of my brief interactions with the board. He skimmed them with the efficiency of someone used to scanning critical field reports. When he finished, he slid the papers neatly into a portfolio. "All right," he said, glancing around at the bulldozers and construction fencing that now encroached upon his property line. "First things first, let's see what they filed with the county. We need to verify if they pulled a demolition permit, and if so, on what grounds." I barely recognized him. This was Jackson in his element, strategizing, calmly dissecting the enemy's every move. Within the hour, we were at the county courthouse, rummaging through public records. Sure enough, the HOA had filed a condemnation request, but the documentation was suspiciously incomplete, missing key signatures and dated after the house had already been razed. It appeared the HOA had bulldozed first and scrounged for legal cover later. Jackson's jaw tightened. "This is fraudulent," he said, tapping the papers. "They filed it under emergency condemnation for hazardous structure." "That's nonsense." We left with copies in hand. Outside, Jackson stared at the horizon, where the sun was dipping behind a row of oak trees. His next move was uncharacteristic. He pulled out his phone and made a call. "Colonel Matthews? I need a favor." "Yes, the civilian matter I mentioned. I need to arrange a meeting with the local city council and possibly the mayor. Tomorrow, if possible." I overheard bits and pieces, military courtesy titles, mention of building an official timeline, and references to an Army Community Relations liaison. My cousin's reach extended well beyond Glendale Forest Estates, and while he never flaunted it in this case, he needed to use every resource to set things right. That night, Jackson and I stayed at a modest motel. He insisted on paying in cash, old habits from overseas deployments. Over a cup of strong black coffee, he began flipping through the HOA's CC and RS, scanning each page carefully. "They're counting on intimidation. It usually works on people who can't afford to fight back or don't know how to navigate bureaucracy," he remarked. His voice was calm, but there was a cold spark in his eyes. He asked about the neighbors, who might stand with us, who might be too afraid to speak up. I relayed everything I'd learned. He frowned at the mention of Hugh Ross. "I recognize that name," he said. "He's a retired corporate attorney from one of those big law firms. Probably the type who enjoys throwing his weight around." Early the next morning, we drove to Glendale City Hall for a meeting with the mayor's office. A city council member, a short woman with a commanding presence named Councilwoman Esterfield, joined us in a private room. She listened intently as Jackson explained the unlawful demolition, presenting each piece of evidence in a neat chronological sequence. When he finished, Councilwoman Esterfield leaned forward, her brow furrowed. "General Hale, this is a serious accusation. The city does not condone demolitions without proper documentation. If what you say is accurate, Glendale Forest Estates HOA may be liable for considerable damages, both to you personally and potentially to the city if they violated local ordinances." Jackson nodded, offering a polite smile. "I'm not looking for a giant payday, Councilwoman. I want accountability. I want them to rebuild what they destroyed or compensate me so I can do it myself. And I want them to stop harassing homeowners with bogus violations." Her gaze flicked from me to Jackson. "We'll investigate swiftly. You have my word. In the meantime, I suggest you file a formal complaint with the county district attorney. The fraudulent permit filing is especially concerning." We left City Hall with fresh momentum. As we exited the building, a camera crew from the local news station approached, likely tipped off by the mention of a high-ranking military officer. Jackson allowed them a brief statement, but he was succinct. "I'm here to ensure a grave injustice is righted. Homeowners should not live in fear of the organizations meant to serve them." His calm demeanor on camera belied a quiet fury that grew each hour. After the cameras switched off, we headed to Glendale Forest Estates for a face-to-face confrontation with Hugh Ross and his board. Parking near the clubhouse, we found the main door locked. A sign indicated an emergency board meeting in progress. Undeterred, Jackson pounded on the door until an elderly volunteer, her eyes wide, cracked it open. "We're in a closed session," she whispered. Without missing a beat, Jackson said, "That's fine. You can let them know General Hale is here." His tone was unflinching. Moments later, the door opened fully, and we saw the board members seated around a long table. Hugh Ross sat at the head, looking supremely annoyed. Phyllis scowled at us from a corner, her notepad trembling in her hand. Ross cleared his throat. "General Hale, we weren't expecting you to return so soon. We're in a private meeting." Jackson stepped forward, his posture like steel. "I'm a member of this community, and I have the right to attend a board meeting unless it's an executive session for legal counsel. If you're discussing the matter of my property, which I strongly suspect you are, then I have every right to be present." Ross opened his mouth to retort, but no sound came out. He cast a nervous glance around the table. Finally, he tried a firm tone. "We regret the misunderstanding, but the condemnation and demolition were fully authorized. Any further discussion should go through our legal channels." Jackson set the folder of evidence in front of Ross, who stared at it as if it were a coiled snake. "I'm giving you a chance to rectify this, Mr. Ross. You can cooperate or face what's coming. An illegal demolition doesn't just vanish. Not when you've destroyed a decorated U.S. Army general's home without proper notice or cause." The room went silent. Someone coughed uneasily. Even Phyllis, who seemed to relish confrontation, kept her head down. Hugh Ross tried to maintain eye contact with Jackson, but faltered. They had finally come to grips with the reality. The quiet neighbor they thought they could bully with petty infractions was, in fact, someone with deep knowledge of how to handle a crisis, someone trained to deal with adversaries far more formidable than a suburban HOA. A tense week followed. Word spread quickly that Glendale Forest Estates HOA had demolished the home of a U.S. Army general under dubious circumstances. Neighbors who had once feared the board started speaking out about similarly aggressive tactics. Fines for minuscule infractions, unexplained penalties, intimidation when they questioned budget allocations. The local news stations ran with the story, featuring Jackson in a series of interviews. Though Jackson tried to keep a low profile out of habit, he recognized that public pressure might be the only way to get swift justice. At the same time, the city council's investigation uncovered a history of questionable condemnations that had forced several long-term homeowners to sell at rock-bottom prices. The board had been using a pattern of intimidation to expand the community's resources, presumably for their own grand designs. Eventually, we received notice that a formal hearing would be held at the county courthouse. On a crisp, clear morning, Jackson and I arrived to find an unexpectedly large crowd. Residents, reporters, and curious onlookers who'd heard rumors of the HOA scandal. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere buzzed with anticipation. The hearing proceeded with the presentation of evidence. Jackson's counsel, a firm recommended by his military connections, systematically dismantled the HOA's defense. They showed how Glendale Forest Estates had not only misrepresented the condition of Jackson's home, but also expedited a demolition permit using falsified documents. Witnesses testified about the short turnaround time between the supposed condemnation and the actual bulldozing. Experts argued the structure was sound, not hazardous, and indeed had undergone routine maintenance. Hugh Ross took the stand, exuding confidence at first. He tried to paint Jackson as an absentee homeowner who had neglected property responsibilities. But under cross-examination, inconsistencies in his statements became glaringly obvious. When pressed about why the HOA did not wait for Jackson's response or go through standard legal channels, Ross stumbled. Even Phyllis's meticulously kept notes worked against them, revealing the board's internal memos, showing they wanted Jackson's plot for their clubhouse expansion. Across the aisle, Jackson sat tall, hands folded in front of him, the very picture of discipline. Now and then, he'd give a measured nod to confirm a point. Only I could sense the simmering anger beneath his composure. After 2 days of testimony, the judge found the HOA's actions both illegal and malicious. In a stern rebuke, the judge ordered the HOA to compensate Jackson for the full value of his demolished property, plus additional damages for loss of personal possessions, emotional distress, and legal fees. The figure was significant, enough to ensure the board couldn't just write it off as the cost of doing business. The judge also mandated stricter oversight of the HOA by the county, including a requirement that major decisions be reviewed by an independent committee. Within days, Hugh Ross resigned as HOA president, citing health reasons, and Phyllis soon followed, complaining of unfair public scrutiny. The remaining board members faced the reality that their reign of intimidation was over. Despite his vindication, Jackson was pensive. One evening, back at my apartment where he'd been staying, he stared at a half-filled box of mementos salvaged from the wreck. He picked up a dented photo of himself receiving a medal in Afghanistan, the glass shattered. "I had a lifetime of memories in that house," he said, voice soft with regret. "I'd planned to retire there for good. Now it's gone." I placed a hand on his shoulder. "You can rebuild," I said, "or find someplace better. The settlement is enough, right?" He nodded. "I can rebuild, but it won't be the same. That cottage was a dream I earned through years of service." A week passed, and soon Glendale Forest Estates was abuzz with rumors that the new interim HOA board wanted to make amends. They offered to rebuild Jackson's home at a discounted rate, with the community's own labor, as a gesture of goodwill. But Jackson politely declined. "I'm not sure I want to spend my future in a place that let this happen," he told them. In the end, Jackson chose a quiet piece of land a few miles away, a wide open space by a gently flowing river. He decided to design a new home from the ground up, a place free from the stifling grip of an overbearing HOA. Over the next few months, he supervised every detail, ensuring it had the same rustic charm he loved: vaulted ceilings, cedar paneling, and a porch overlooking the water. He even included a special patch of tall grass for migrating geese, now safe from nosy regulators. On move-in day, I stood beside him on that new porch. He took a deep breath, as if letting go of all the tension accumulated over the past months. "They thought they could push me around because I was gone," he said, his voice steady. "But you can't bulldoze a man's pride and expect no consequences. I'm just sorry for everyone else they harmed along the way." I nodded. "At least we exposed them. The new board is more transparent, and a lot of residents are grateful." "You changed things, Jackson." He offered a small grin. "Maybe so. Doesn't replace what I lost, but it sure feels good to know they can't do this to anyone else." As the sun dipped behind the hills, bathing the new home in shades of gold and crimson, I realized how fitting it was. Jackson had served his country for decades, facing threats far from home. Yet one of his hardest battles took place right here on American soil, against an unlikely adversary, a homeowners association that had forgotten its true purpose. From that day forward, Glendale Forest Estates was a cautionary tale for HOAs everywhere. And Jackson, a steadfast soldier, had once again demonstrated that injustice is no match for someone who fights with honor, calm determination, and unwavering devotion to what's right. He hadn't sought a fight, but once it came knocking, there was never any doubt he would win. And in the process, he reminded all of us that the greatest battles can sometimes erupt in the most ordinary places, like a quiet street in a suburban neighborhood, where the fundamental principles of fairness and respect should never be bulldozed under any circumstance. End.